She stood in silence, watching him fall apart one song at a time. His body was failing. His voice was fading. He sat on stage like a fallen king, too weak to stand and too proud to quit. Ozzy Osbourne was on the throne while gripping the mic with both hands like it was the last thing holding him up. And just off stage, Sharon Osbourne just stood there in silence. To the whole world, it looked like loyalty. But to her, it was something else entirely. Because days later, she was gone. Not just from the stage, but from everything. Her career, her Hollywood empire, her entire public life. 1 minute, she was everywhere. The next, she vanished. No explanation, no goodbye. Some called it strategy, but many believed it was something else entirely, her final act of love. But when it comes to Sharon Osbourne, love is never that simple. Maybe even dangerous, because the real story isn't in what she said. It's in what she didn't. Before the hospital beds and the farewell tours, before Ozzy sat on stage like a ghost of the man she turned into a legend, there was fire, raw, explosive, and unapologetic. And Sharon was always the one striking the match. Their story didn't look like love. It looked like chaos, hotel brawls, cheating scandals, bloody breakdowns, rehab stints, and career comebacks no one saw coming. But somehow, through every headline and every collapse, Sharon and Ozzy stayed locked together. And if they weren't side by side, they were screaming at each other or signing a new contract. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was a war story dressed in couture, a business deal sealed with eyeliner and spilled wine. Back in 1979, when Ozzy was kicked out of Black Sabbath for being too messed up even for them, most people wrote him off as done. But not Sharon. She saw an opportunity. She didn't just stay by his side, she rebuilt him, brick by messy brick, put together a solo band, and named the first album Blizzard of Oz. It sold it like he was still on top of the world. And just like that, Ozzy was back, but more louder, crazier, and entirely hers. She wasn't just a wife. She was a manager, strategist, and a fire starter. Every tour date, album deal, every ridiculous TV moment, Sharon was behind it. If Ozzy was the product, Sharon was the factory. And she was running it on caffeine, fury, and whatever power lives in a woman who refuses to let her husband die irrelevant. Their marriage became a brand, disasters became content. And by the time the Osbournes hit TV in 2002, America was obsessed. The audiences couldn't get enough of Ozzy stumbling around the house, mumbling like a lost toddler, while Sharon screamed across the mansion with a Pomeranian in one hand and a $1 million contract in the other. They turned dysfunction into a multi-million-dollar empire. And Sharon knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't actually subtle. When Iron Maiden insulted Ozzy at Ozfest in 2005, she didn't release a statement. She stormed the stage and threw eggs. Yeah, real eggs in front of thousands of fans. Because no one talked about her husband like that and walked away clean. That wasn't just loyalty, that was territory, and Sharon was marking her claim. Ozzy knew her love language. It was brutal, cold, and true. She didn't romanticize survival. She definitely weaponized it. Sharon always knew the value of an empire, and she wasn't about to let hers fall apart in the tabloids without controlling the story. For decades, Ozzy was the chaos, and Sharon was the calm that knew how to sell it. He'd fall off the wagon, she'd clean it up. He'd collapse on tour, she'd reschedule the next one. If he disappeared for days, she'd find him, curse him out, and then book the next magazine cover. So this is what they call love? Yeah, seems like. But every machine breaks down eventually. And when Ozzy's body began to fail, Parkinson's, surgeries, spinal damage, even Sharon couldn't schedule around that. His voice, his walk, even his mind started to fade. It began slowly, quieter than any of his albums ever were, with a shake in his hands, tremble in his voice. Something Sharon first dismissed as exhaustion, tour stress, or age. But it wasn't that. In 2020, Ozzy publicly revealed what had been whispered behind closed doors for months. He had Parkinson's disease, type 2, a rare form that attacked not just his motor skills, but his strength and mind. It was the first time the world saw him fragile. Not drunk, drugged, or wild, just human. And the breakdown didn't stop there. In February 2019, Ozzy slipped in his darkened home, hit the floor like a ton of bricks, and re-injured the metal rods already in his neck from a 2003 ATV accident. The doctors told him he'd be paralyzed without surgery. Over 4 months, he endured multiple operations, nerve damage, bone fragments, and agonizing rehab. Ozzy called that year the worst years of his life. In the mid-year, he had canceled all remaining tour dates. The fall left him permanently wobbling, with a right arm so numb it stayed cold. By 2023, he confirmed it would be his final surgery. For a man who once jumped off a hotel balcony into a pool just because he could, this was a real hell. The darkness he once played with, now it lived inside his bones. At that time, Sharon flew him to Switzerland, arranged for private clinics, stem cell treatments, immune therapy, and experimental surgeries. She was willing to try anything but letting him give up. And every time the press asked how Ozzy was doing, she smiled and said, "He's a warrior." But behind the curtain, it was uglier. He had multiple surgeries over 3 years, one after another. Some worked, and some didn't. At one point, Ozzy admitted he couldn't feel his legs. He was in agony every single day. That's why he canceled tours, canceled TV appearances, and everything except trying. And Sharon? Of course she didn't cry on camera, she just organized the next move. Ozzy wanted to quit. She wouldn't let him. For her, it wasn't the end, even when it was starting to look like it. By 2023, Ozzy could barely stand. His speech was slurred as he struggled to remember words. Yet Sharon was pushing for a final tour, not because she didn't care, but because they both knew this was all they had left: the stage, the crowd, the legacy they built together, and maybe the goodbye. In July 2023, he canceled his entire European tour. For the first time, Ozzy said it out loud, "I'm not physically capable anymore." He called it one of the hardest things I've ever had to share. It broke something in him permanently. Yet Sharon stayed. She stayed through the memory lapses, the rage, the crying, and the silence. She stayed when he couldn't walk to the bathroom, because she knew the only thing left of the man she married was the name. And while the tabloids spun stories, euthanasia pacts, secret assisted suicide deals, Sharon never flinched. She gave interviews to shut them down. She never denied their private pain, but she never handed it over either. This wasn't just Ozzy dying slowly, it was Sharon refusing to let it happen without meaning. However, she could see it now, clearer than ever. No matter how many stem cell procedures she approved, how many carefully chosen scripts kept his name glowing in the headlines, nothing was going to fix this. The legend was slipping through her fingers, slowly, brutally, and there was no miracle left to delay what was already coming. So when even science bowed out and the spotlight began to dim, what did she do? Well, as they called their sacrifice love, the world and the tabloids in their usual dramatic flair called it her final act. But those who followed Sharon Osbourne long enough, they've seen the patterns and the timing, so they had another name for it. Strategy. In the summer of 2025, just days after Ozzy performed what would be remembered as his final concert in his hometown of Birmingham, Sharon made her biggest move in years. She walked away, completely. She announced she was stepping down from her remaining media roles, giving up the spotlight she'd ruled for decades and heading back to the UK. Sharon was retiring, or so it seemed. The LA mansion was locked up, cameras were off, and the red carpets were done. Sharon Osbourne, the loud, fabulous, unshakable rock and roll manager turned reality TV queen, was turning the page. The headlines didn't hold back. They exploded with different titles. It sounded emotional, tragic, and even beautiful. The kind of love story people want to believe in. The long, chaotic marriage was now finding peace in its final stretch. But let's be honest, Sharon Osbourne didn't rise to power by accident, and she's never been afraid to play the game. This was the woman who rebuilt Ozzy's career from the ashes after Black Sabbath kicked him out. The same woman who created The Osbournes, one of the wildest, weirdest, most influential reality shows in TV history. She was the mastermind behind whatever they did. The iron gate between Ozzy and the world. And suddenly she was stepping away? After decades of running their brand like a machine, Sharon powered it all down right at the most critical, most visible moment of their shared story. And here's where the timing gets spicy. She held her ground when Ozzy was first diagnosed with Parkinson's. She stayed through the early surgeries, stood by him during the near-death infections, and never backed away, even when the media hounded them for retirement announcements like vultures circling. She stepped back right after the final performance, just as public sympathy was peaking, as Ozzy's name was splashed across headlines again, and as the cameras were already rolling. At the exact moment when most would have leaned in for the spotlight, Sharon quietly bowed out. So coincidence? You tell us. Now don't get it twisted. This doesn't mean her move wasn't real. Sharon may be a strategist, but she's also a wife, a mother, and a survivor. She battled cancer, handled public collapse, stood beside Ozzy through drug-fueled spirals, cheating scandals, and onstage disasters. And yes, she's still standing. So if anyone deserves to step away and take care of her husband, it's her. But the reason it hit so hard was because of how perfectly timed it was. After the explosive fallout on The Talk in 2021, Sharon Osbourne's U.S. television career took a brutal hit. It all started when she defended her longtime friend Piers Morgan, after he criticized Meghan Markle's Oprah interview. On live TV, her co-host Cheryl Underwood pressed Sharon about standing by someone many called racist. What followed was a heated, uncomfortable exchange that sparked backlash almost instantly. The episode went viral, public opinion split, and within weeks, Sharon was out. She later claimed she was set up by the network and betrayed by the show she helped build. Whatever the truth, the damage was done, and Sharon's place in daytime TV never recovered. However, the British media never stopped loving her. Her accent, drama, unapologetic comebacks, she was tabloid royalty. She launched new projects, from documentaries to horror reality shows, and always found a way to insert herself right back into pop culture's bloodstream. So when she suddenly unplugged everything, people didn't just feel sad, they got suspicious.
That's suspicious.
Because Sharon Osbourne doesn't just disappear. She's the one who's always directed the show, especially when it comes to Ozzy. So when she called it stepping back, we saw something else entirely. We saw her stepping into the role of legacy manager, image handler, emotional anchor, and yes, grieving wife-in-waiting. It was elegant, powerful, a little haunting, and absolutely genius. We can't deny that. This move didn't just protect Ozzy, it elevated Sharon. She was no longer the loud one on TV, the villain from talk shows. She became something else, something softer, a woman who gave it all up to care for her dying husband. The media bought it, fans adored it, and most importantly, it worked. She became untouchable again. She couldn't imagine spending another minute on a soundstage while Ozzy was home, slipping further away. But with Sharon, it's never just one reason. It was always layered and loaded, as if it was planned. Her so-called final act wasn't just an exit. It was a rebranding, a masterclass in timing concealed with legacy and control. And when she turned off the cameras, she did what she always does. She made sure they were all still looking. So now comes the real question, the one that nobody ever wants to say out loud. After everything Sharon did for Ozzy, the chaos she handled, the empire she ran, the breakdowns she rebuilt, was it all love? Was this a decades-long love story? Or a PR masterpiece wrapped in ugly truth? Maybe it was both. Their relationship from the outside was messy with addiction, cheating, and public breakdowns. One minute he was biting bats, the next she was throwing wedding rings into the ocean. But somehow, through all of that, there were always these little moments, like Sharon holding his hand during rehab, Ozzy breaking down on TV, saying he didn't deserve her. And then there were the storms as well. In 2016, the cheating scandal hit hard. Ozzy admitted he'd had an affair with celebrity hairstylist Michelle Pugh, and the tabloids tore them to pieces. But this wasn't a one-time mistake. Sharon later revealed he had been involved with 6 different women. Michelle, though, was the most prominent, a long-term affair that shook the core of their marriage. Ozzy publicly confessed he was struggling with a sex addiction, entered therapy, and apologized, saying he was mortified by his actions and that Sharon was his whole life. But a few weeks later, she was back on the talk, sitting tall, saying, "I'm 63 years old and I can't keep living like this. I don't need it, but I still love him." And just like that, she took him back. Some people called it strength, others called it showbiz survival, but no one could ignore the power in how she handled it. And yet, on the other side, they don't forget the Sharon who pulled Ozzy out of a drug coma, quit gigs to stay home during his worst health years, and who took his overdose calls in the middle of the night and still showed up for work the next morning like nothing happened. Their story wasn't clean, but it was never fake. And that's what makes this so hard to label. Sharon wasn't just his wife. She was his lifeline and everything, as she played so many roles in his life. So, is that love? Or is that long-term damage control? Now think about this. When the media called her the woman behind the man, they weren't wrong. But they weren't right either. She wasn't behind him. She was next to him, above him, around him, and running him. Sharon Osbourne didn't just support Ozzy, she literally shaped him. And yes, it's complicated. He wouldn't be the Prince of Darkness without her, but she wouldn't be Sharon Osbourne without him either. That's not just drama, that's the whole story. She stayed through all the stuff, facing for him in their lives, and she worked. She took the hit every time the ship rocked, and then she polished the name until it was gold again. And maybe that's love. Or simply, that's just Sharon. So when Ozzy said, "I made a huge mistake," without Sharon, I am nothing. I love her. He wasn't wrong. And when she stayed beside him while the rest of the world moved on, that wasn't for cameras, that was for him. Once Sharon stepped out of TV, stopped new projects, and returned home to the UK full-time, the rumor mill sped up like it had a jet engine. Suddenly, people were circulating claims that she planned Ozzy's farewell, that she was orchestrating his final tour as some grand exhibition, that she'd constructed a death pact to push his legacy higher. The headlines exploded without nuance, but the Osbourne family didn't feed the story. Instead, they held their silence like armor. Back in 2007 and again in 2023, Sharon had discussed euthanasia in the event of brain decline, saying she and Ozzy had drawn plans to go to Switzerland's assisted suicide clinics if dementia ever struck. That thing resurfaced in every conspiracy-laced story. It was reframed as a sinister agreement, a pact of convenience rather than a deeply personal pre-plan. When people dug up that old clip and combined it with Ozzy's visibly worsening posture and speech, critics bent it into a narrative that had nothing to do with reality. That's when Kelly Osbourne stepped in. On Instagram stories in mid-July 2025, she called these claims out with honesty and fury. She refuted the notion of any suicide pact, labeling it "my mom said to get attention one time," and reminded everyone that her father clearly had Parkinson's and mobility issues, but he was not and had not been dying. She slammed an AI-generated video claiming Ozzy was on his deathbed, saying it was cruel and misleading, and demanded that people stop spreading falsehoods for clicks. Still, the media thrived on morbidity. The theories circulated that Sharon was planning a scripted exit, one last press tour, a pre-recorded tribute speech to drop after Ozzy's death, and staged surprise memorials. None of that ever happened. The family remained silent until Ozzy passed on July 22, 2025 at age 76, surrounded by his family in Buckinghamshire. The cause was really obvious about his complications from Parkinson's disease. The family requested privacy and publicly mourned his death in a short shared statement. But wait here, nothing sells like tragedy. The black and white headlines rake in the views. They change the angle and even tie it to a conspiracy theory. They whispered that Ozzy's death was planned. A wild theory that twisted tied back to vague remarks in old interviews, past addictions, and bizarre health declines. However, there's no evidence. And if it's not true, even better. To be honest, it wasn't all about strategy and control. Plenty of critics believed Sharon pulled Ozzy into the spotlight for decades just to keep her own empire alive, swapping scandals for content, heartbreaks for ratings. Ultimately, this part isn't about assigning blame or absolution. It's about acknowledging a layered truth. Sharon may have managed Ozzy's brand, but she also protected his dignity when everything else faded. She didn't star in the headlines. Those were written without her input. And when she disappeared, it felt like she was saying goodbye to fame, but also safeguarding a private goodbye that no camera could capture. She had spent decades managing madness, from blood-soaked stages to chaotic hotel rooms and red carpets littered with scandals. Sharon Osbourne had done it all. So when Ozzy's body began to betray him with his surgeries and Parkinson's diagnosis, Sharon was done with her job. And for once, she didn't do it loudly. She left her US talk shows, glittering LA lifestyle, and the clout she once chased. She packed up and moved back to the UK for him. For a woman who built her empire out of chaos, that silence was the loudest thing she'd ever done. And yeah, some called it her final act of love. That's the phrase that echoed across headlines, as if it were her mic drop moment of the glamorous wife turning her back on fame, to hold her husband's hand in his final years. We all know Sharon has always been 5 steps ahead. The woman who once threw ham at her neighbors and eggs at Iron Maiden's stage isn't exactly someone who bows out gracefully. She chooses her exits. She designs her drama. And in this case, the move was surgical. Now Ozzy's legacy is carved in stone, louder than life, louder than pain. And Sharon's final act wasn't to save him. It was to preserve him, to make sure the world remembered the man he used to be, before they could watch him fade into someone he wasn't. Sharon never begged for pity. She just wanted to end it right, which in true Osbourne fashion, even the quiet looked dramatic. So when the lights dimmed and the music stopped, Sharon didn't cry on cue. She didn't turn her pain into a production. She just made sure that the last image of Ozzy Osbourne wasn't of a man broken by disease or worn down by time, but of a legend, bowed but unshaken. That's what you do when love isn't a performance, and you don't take a bow. You actually draw the curtain. And that's how Sharon left as the only person who ever dared to love Ozzy through everything, and then knew when to let go, with both hands still trembling. So, what do you think? Was Sharon Osbourne's final act pure love or power? One last time. Would you stay that long for someone like Ozzy? Let us know in the comments below. And if you think this story was wild, don't forget to watch What Melania Always Knew and Why She Stayed Anyway.